On the night of March 18, 1984, the president of one of Japan's largest candy companies was dragged naked from his own bathtub by two masked men. His name was Katsuhisa Ezaki, but his kidnapping was only the beginning. What followed was a 17-month reign of terror that would paralyze an entire nation, poison its candy supply, humiliate its police force, and drive one officer to set himself on fire. And to this day, the people responsible have never been identified. Katsuhisa Ezaki was 42 years old and the president of Ezaki Glico, the company behind some of Japan's most beloved snacks, Pocky Sticks, Pratt's crackers, and Glico caramels that had been a staple of Japanese childhoods for decades. And so Ezaki wasn't just a businessman. He was something of a national figure, the man whose family name was printed on the candy that practically every child in Japan had grown up eating. He lived in a quiet residential neighborhood in Nishinomiya with his wife Mikieko, who was 35, and their three children, 11-year-old Etsuro, 8-year-old Mariko, and little Yukiko, who was only 4. His 70-year-old mother Yoshi lived in the house right next door on the same property. It was a close family, the kind where grandma was always just a few steps away, and the children could run between houses without ever leaving the yard. On that evening in March, the household had settled into its usual routine. Itsuro and Ukiko were already asleep in their rooms. Mikiko and Mariko were in the living room. And Ezaki was soaking in the bath, washing away another long day of board meetings and production schedules. He had no idea that two men had already broken into his mother Yoshi's house next door, stolen the spare key to his home, and were now moving silently through his front door. They found Miss Ieko and Mariko first. The two masked men, armed with what appeared to be a rifle and a pistol, bound them both and locked them inside a bathroom. And then they went for Ezaki. They dragged him from the tub, still dripping wet, still naked, and forced him into a waiting vehicle. But what makes this story so strange isn't the kidnapping itself, it's what happened after. The kidnappers took Ezaki to a small, cold warehouse on the outskirts of Ibaraki, Osaka, and left him there. By midnight, a director at Glico had been directed to a payphone booth, where he found a note demanding 1 billion yen, roughly $4.5 million American dollars, along with 100 kilograms of gold bullion. It was the largest ransom ever demanded in Japanese history. But Ezaki was not the kind of man to sit and wait for someone else to save him. For 65 hours he sat in that warehouse, hands bound, shivering in the dark, studying every detail of his surroundings. And on the third night, March 21st, he found his chance. The details of his escape have never been fully disclosed, but somehow the 42-year-old candy executive broke free of his restraints and fled into the night. Police found him wandering the streets of Ibaraki, disoriented but alive. The ransom was never paid, and so Ezaki assumed the nightmare was over. But it had barely begun. Within weeks of the kidnapping, strange things began happening at Glico's headquarters. On April 10th, several vehicles in the company's parking lot were set on fire. 6 days later, security guards discovered a plastic container filled with hydrochloric acid inside one of Glico's own buildings, and then the letters started arriving. They were addressed to newspapers and media outlets across the Kansai region, written in a mix of hiragana and Osaka dialect, and signed by a group calling themselves Kwaijin no Juichi Mensu, the monster with 21 faces. The name was borrowed from a fictional villain in the detective novels of Edogawa Renpo, Japan's answer to Edgar Allan Poe. And the choice was deliberate. It was a taunt. The monster with 21 faces was a literary master of disguise who could never be caught, and this group was saying the same thing about themselves. "Dear dumb police officers," one letter read, "don't tell a lie. All crimes begin with a lie, as we say in Japan. Don't you know that?" Another declared, "There's so many of you. What on earth are you doing? If you are real pros, try catching us." But the letters weren't just insults. They contained demands, deadlines, and specific instructions for delivering ransom payments to Glico. And so the police mobilized in unprecedented numbers. At the height of the investigation, 44,000 officers were deployed, roughly one-fifth of Japan's entire police force. They visited 3.2 million homes and businesses in the Osaka area alone, chasing down 28,000 tips. And then, on June 26, 1984, the monsters sent one final message about Glico. It read simply, "We forgive Glico." But what seemed like an ending was actually a pivot, because the monster with 21 faces wasn't finished. They were just picking a new target. In October of 1984, the monster turned its attention to Morinaga, another of Japan's largest candy companies, and what came next sent the entire nation into a panic. A letter addressed to moms of the nation arrived at Osaka news agencies. 20 packages of Morinaga candy, it claimed, had been laced with sodium cyanide and placed on store shelves across Japan. This wasn't a bluff. Police scrambled to search stores from Tokyo to western Japan, and what they found was horrifying. Over a dozen packages of Morinaga Choco Balls and Angel Pie were pulled from convenience stores and supermarkets, each one injected with enough potassium cyanide to kill. The group had attached tiny labels reading, "Danger, contains toxins." But the labels were so small that a child reaching for candy would almost certainly never notice them. By February of 1985, police had recovered a total of 21 lethal packages from shelves across the country. It was nothing short of a miracle that nobody died. But that wasn't even the worst part. The monster didn't just want Morinaga to suffer. They wanted every food company in Japan to live in fear. Letters went out to Marudai Ham and House Foods Corporation with similar threats, and the psychological damage was catastrophic even without a single casualty. Morinaga products vanished from every store shelf in Japan overnight. The company was hemorrhaging an estimated $120,000 every single day. Nearly 500 workers lost their jobs. The president was forced to resign. An entire industry brought to its knees by an invisible enemy. The same group that had once dragged a candy executive naked from his own bathtub. And then the investigation took its strangest turn yet. The police devised an elaborate sting operation. An undercover investigator, disguised as a Marudai Ham employee, followed the monster's instructions to deliver a ransom. He boarded a train heading toward the designated drop-off location. But as the train rattled to the outskirts of Osaka, the officer noticed someone watching him from across the car, a large, well-built man wearing sunglasses, with short permed hair and narrow, piercing eyes. The officer would later describe those eyes as looking like those of a fox. The fox-eyed man. He would become the most tantalizing lead in the entire investigation and its most devastating failure. What they discovered next changed everything. Officers managed to track the fox-eyed man to a nearby parking lot in Shiga Prefecture, where he was spotted climbing into a stolen white station wagon alongside an unidentified accomplice. Police radioed for backup. Units from across the prefecture converged on the area. And then, in what became the single most humiliating moment in Japanese law enforcement history, both men simply vanished. The stolen car was found abandoned on a dirt road. The fox-eyed man and his partner had melted into the night as if they had never existed at all. Over 1 million police officers would eventually work some aspect of his case. More than 125,000 people were investigated. 28,000 tips poured in from across Japan, and not a single arrest was ever made. The monster with 21 faces, just like its fictional namesake, was a phantom, and the officer who had been in charge of the Shiga Prefecture operation that night, a 59-year-old superintendent named Shoji Yamamoto, would carry the weight of that failure for the rest of his life, which would not be much longer. On the morning of August 7, 1985, Superintendent Shoji Yamamoto walked into the backyard of his official residence in Shiga Prefecture. He had been quietly reassigned from his command, removed from his position in the wake of the fox-eyed man's escape. For months, Yamamoto had carried the shame of that night. In Japanese police culture, where honor and duty are inseparable, the failure was not simply professional, it was existential. Yamamoto stood in the small garden behind his house, surrounded by the sounds of a summer morning in rural Japan. Cicadas humming in the trees, The distant murmur of traffic on a nearby road, the faint rustle of wind through the hedges. It was the kind of peaceful, ordinary moment that makes what happened next almost impossible to process. Yamamoto poured kerosene over his own body, and in one act of unbearable finality, he struck a match. He was 59 years old. He left no public note. But the message was understood by everyone. He had failed to catch the monster, and for Shoji Yamamoto, that failure was something he could not live with. The news rippled across Japan within hours, and for 5 days the nation held its breath, waiting to see if the monster with 21 faces would respond. They did. On August 12th, 5 days after Yamamoto's death, the monster sent what would be their final letter. Yamamoto of Shiga Prefecture Police died, it read. How stupid of him. Don't let bad guys like us get away with it. And then it concluded with 2 lines that have haunted investigators ever since. We are bad guys. That means we've got more to do other than bullying companies. It's fun to lead a bad man's life. And then silence. The monster with 21 faces was never heard from again. The case was never solved. The statute of limitations on Katsuhisa Isaki's kidnapping expired in 1995. The final deadline for the poisoning charges ran out in the year 2000. Over 1 million officers had worked the case across 17 months. 125,000 suspects had been investigated. Not a single person was ever charged. Katsuhisa Ezaki returned to running Glico and rebuilt the company into the global powerhouse it is today. The same Pocky sticks and Pretz crackers that his family's company had always made are now sold in dozens of countries around the world. His wife, Mikio, who had been bound and locked in a bathroom that night in March of 1984, and his daughter, Mariko, who was only 8 years old when masked men invaded her home, had to live with the knowledge that the people who terrorized their family were never caught. His mother, Yoshi, whose house was broken into first, whose spare key was used to enter her own son's home, spent her remaining years knowing that the men who shattered her family's sense of safety simply walked away. Superintendent Yamamoto's self-immolation remained the only death directly connected to the case. The fox-eyed man was never identified, and somewhere in Japan, the people who called themselves the monster with 21 faces lived out the rest of their lives exactly as they promised. As bad guys having fun, the case file remains open. No one has ever been charged.